It's great to be here today. My presentation today would be about the exercise we've made about mapping the mobile gaming market, the circumstances that led to actually doing that, what we've learned, and how it might be applicable to you. So when I first joined King, I was lucky enough to join an awesome team that was working on a hidden object game. A hidden object game is a type of game where you find hidden objects in complex scenes like this. And it usually has some design and slight narrative meta layer. And this is going to be important later on, so keep that fact in mind. Now, what happened is that the game ended up being canceled as we concluded that the market opportunity wasn't large enough, and we decided to put the project to rest. And what that meant is that a lot of the team was free to go and look at other things, and specifically, what we were after is trying to find hybrid opportunities. Now, a hybrid is a game that incorporates elements from one or more games. So you could have the core gameplay or minute-to-minute gameplay of a first-person shooter. So you walk around shooting enemies, and the meta layer of a base builder. So when you shoot those enemies, you go and collect some resources that you use to build your base. And the question that we were asking ourselves was to start with our customers, with the players, and ask who this game is for. Now, games are very different than any other products you might develop, because what we want is not players just to get utility out of the game, but rather we want them to fall in love with the game. We want them to really connect to the game and get engaged with it. So in a sense, we're playing matchmakers between our product, the game, and the players. So let's talk about a second what it takes to be a good matchmaker. And let's assume we have this guy. He's a fisherman who's looking for his partner to fall in love with. So the first thing we're going to do is to collect the data about all the different things this guy likes. And when we want to find the hybrid or the partner that matches all of those things, we find what's there that maximizes all of the things he likes. Problem is that some hybrids are better than others. And this is precisely why game making is an art, and you can't just have like a spec and a recipe and expect to have the same consequence or even a successful consequence every time, and why we have to have all the wonderful creatives and game designers and UX and developers and all the people that work towards making games. And this is just to say that I think this is a great framework that we've developed, but you can't just apply it and expect a magic result. So let's leave our fisherman with his newfound love and go back to talk about what the problem we were facing, which was creating a hybrid. Now, we were trying to figure out what this hybrid might be. And what we were looking for were the audiences, not the specific games, but audiences of different games, right? And what we cared about is how to combine them. So what we were after were the connections between those audiences. And those connections are the affinity I'm going to talk a lot about during this presentation. Now, for now, let's summarize affinity as having a measure of probability. So if games A and B have an affinity value of 4, it means players from game A are 4 times more likely to play game B, and vice versa. And these are the links that we were looking at. And the first thing we had to do was to get some data. And what we turned to was initially Affinity, which is a business intelligence platform. And that was a good start, because we could look at each game individually and see long lists of all the different numbers of all the different games. The problem is that's fine if you're looking at one game at a time, but when you're trying to look at hundreds or thousands of games at once, your brain tends to explode, which is quite bad when you're trying to use it to actually think about an idea. So we've had this problem to solve about creating a way to visualize all the different games and hold all this data in a way that the human mind might explore. So in a sense, we were after a map. And that didn't exist, so we had to create it. We started out by mapping all the top 100 grossing games and all the games within 1 degree of separation, so all the games that had an affinity value of 5 or more with those games as an approximation of the market. Now, this isn't even very nice to look at. It's just a gray blob and you can't really learn anything from it. So we started working on it. The first thing is we added some colors by coloring the different games by their genre taxonomy. We then sized them by the audience size. So it's important to know that we were looking here at game audiences and not the games themselves, and there's a big difference. So each audience is sized by their monthly active users. The bigger, the more users. We then went on to color the connections. Darker lines mean stronger connections, higher affinity, and vice versa. And finally, what we've done is we've used an algorithm called Force Atlas. That's usually used by people who map social networks, by physicists and biologists, and what it does, it simulates gravity. So games that are more similar to one another would gravitate towards each other. The games that have less connections would become outliers. And it's important to know that this has nothing to do with the actual genre taxonomy. So it's by actual connections and actual audience preferences. And we ended up with something that looks like this. So this is a two-dimensional representation of something that in actuality has 5, 6, or even more dimensions. But we were limited by what humans can actually observe. And while we have only 2 axes here, they still make some sense. So if you look at the blue bit here you'd find more your sports game, your strategy, your action RPGs, and so on, games with steeper learning curves. And on this side here, you'd have games that are more casual. So you'd have puzzles, word puzzles, with lighter themes as well. Now, what is this affinity? As it turns out, affinity does have a mathematical formula, which I'm not going to dive in, luckily for you. But I just wanted you to know that there's actual math and science behind it. And to better explain what it actually means, I'd rather go by way of example. So let's look at this game. This is Candy Crush Saga. This game is now approaching its 7th birthday, and it's constantly been at the top of the charts. And mostly because it has a very, very large user base. Now you might wonder, why does a game with a very large user base is such an outlier? Why is it not central? Why doesn't it have connections to many more games, or games that are more different? And that's a great question. And to answer that question, I'm going to use ice cream, or specifically vanilla ice cream, and try to imagine the type of person who might like that vanilla ice cream. It's really hard because people who like vanilla ice cream can really be any type of people and like any type of other flavors. And in a sense, Candy Crush is kind of like that vanilla ice cream. On average, people who like Candy Crush tend to be very, very average, really, because they tend to like a lot of different types of games. But when you look at the center, it's really hard to say anything about the average audience member. And when you're actually looking at people who play Candy Crush, then indeed you see that you'd get like investment bankers, you get parents, you get millennials, you get construction workers. And this is why it makes such a challenge to talk about a game that is such a vanilla flavor of gaming that appeals to everyone. Now, on the other hand, let's try and think about something that's more specific, like vegan cilantro ice cream, and try to imagine the type of person who might like that ice cream. Now, it's much, much easier to have a mental image of that person. And the same goes towards games that have more homogeneous audiences. So if we look at Fortnite here, we see that players who play Fortnite like a lot of the shooters that you can see in brown. They like the one-touch and arcade games, which is the hyper-casual, and sport games. So games that have a faster pace, they often have some entertaining element or some humor in them. And it's easier to imagine what type of players might Fortnite players be. On the other hand of the spectrum, you get the slots games. So slots, as you can see by the very dark lines, have the highest degree of interconnection between the genre, which means that if you meet a slots players, they're quite likely to be playing just slots games and more than one slots game. So you see very little connections to game outside of the genre. So it's, in a sense, it's like a micro constellation on its own in this galaxy of games. To me, though, the most interesting aspect of it was trying to understand the why behind these connections and not just observe what they are, but try and figure out how can we use them to better understand our audiences, how can we get them to build better players, better games, and better features. And that brings us to the 4 building blocks of games. Now, we've looked at hundreds or possibly thousands of different games, different connections through an interactive tool we've built at the overlays of genre, and we came to a few interesting realizations that I'd like to share with you. And to do that, I'd like to talk about the 4 different building blocks, which is the core, the minute-to-minute gameplay, the meta layer of the game, which is the overarching progress, what you'd be doing after weeks or months, the theme that could go anywhere between space and farms, and the actual art style of the game. And to do that, I'd like to try and pitch a game to you live. So as I pitch the game, I want you, if you think this is the type of game you'd like to play, please put your hand up. If at some point you decide this is not something you want to play or change your mind, put it down. So the core of our game is about collecting different parts and designing your own unique look of your character. And the meta is about growing in power, growing in the ranking, along with a community of other players. Or maybe I should rather say a community of other zombies. But these are all very cute zombies. So not many of you actually want to play my game, and granted, it's not feature complete. It's very high-level concept of a game. But still, there's enough here to have an image of the game in your minds. And while it might differ from person to person, it probably evolved and changed as I was going through the pitch of what this game might be. And the same goes for the mobile gaming market. Those different elements are super important, and they can dramatically impact the success of your game, the type of players that go into your game, and even what might the end design of the game would be. So I'd like to start by talking about the core versus the meta, which seems initially to be the most important building blocks, and ask which is more important. And to do that, I'd like to start with puzzle RPGs. So puzzle RPGs are games that incorporate puzzle layers like switchers or linkers or clickers, like this game Farm Hero Saga. And they have a meta progression layer of an RPG, like Fire Emblem Heroes. So you grow your characters, you have equipment, and that's what drives the overarching progression. If you mix them both up, you might end up with something like Empires and Puzzle, a very good puzzle RPG, where you play puzzles to defeat enemies, and then you grow in power, you collect more things, and then you go on to defeat stronger and stronger enemies. And if we look at what it looks like on the map, these are the blue dots here, we see that they have much more in common with the green RPGs than with their switcher and puzzle cousins in the pink and the light green. So to me, what that means is that switcher or puzzle games tend to be sort of a vanilla gaming flavor that you can use to create and to mix and match and create any type of games with any type of meta. But you might have noticed that there's one outlier here, and this outlier is a game called Best Fiends Forever. And this game is different because it shows that it's not just a question of binary. It's not just what you mix, but also how much you mix. So if you put more emphasis on the puzzle and the core gameplay and less on the meta, you end up with a puzzle RPG that's much closer to its puzzle cousins, and also has, as you can see by the colors, much more similar theme and art style, and that impacts the right audience. So let's say I convinced you that those things would impact the type of audience that play your game. Is that something that's actually important, and how big of an impact? So I argue it's a huge impact. So here we have a game called Gardenscapes. It's a really great innovative switcher made by Playrix. And let's try and see what it's made of. So it has like a switcher core, similarly to games like Farm Hero Saga. It has a design meta layer where you build your garden, similar to games like the Pearl's Pearl, which is a hidden object game, or Heyday, which is a resource management game. And finally, it has a story like a lot of hidden object games. And coincidentally, Gardenscapes actually started as a hidden object game. Now, Gardenscapes took about a year until it reached the top charts, and here we see what the map looked like around the time it reached the top charts. And what's interesting to see, it's actually connected to a lot of resource management games, hidden object games, and story adventure games, and not actually to switchers. So in a sense, it's a switcher for non-switcher players. And going back to the game we were working on when I joined King, if we were trying to make a game for hidden object players at the time, we might have ended up with something that's not a hidden object, but incorporates a lot of the elements that we put into the game. So we've talked a bit about the core and the meta, and the question is how much do they impact the game? And at this point, we've done something that's quite unusual for people who deal with data, and is actually talk with players, talk with the actual humans that play the game. And to not go too far, we've done it by way of survey to maintain some quantitative aspect of it. And we've used an adaptation of the Quantic Foundry framework and looking at the 12 different motivations, so things like excitement, strategy, power, and so on, to determine what does an audience profile look like. So this is an example of what does an audience profile look like for switcher players, and you can see that they care a lot about completion, reaching to the next level, finishing all the quests, but also there's an element of strategy and challenge in the game, some excitement, and they care about story and fantasy to a degree. And we've done this exercise not just for one game, but for all the games in our taxonomy. And what we found is that games that look more similar, we've used a number to look at that, like the value, have a higher affinity, and games that are not as similar have lower affinity. And we've repeated this exercise at the connections between all the different genres and all the different elements in our taxonomy, and we found a correlation factor of 0.6 out of a total possible of 1, which is pretty good. So on to the next thing, which is how much of a difference do themes make and how important they are. And to do that, I'd like to look at resource management games. So resource management games are games where you collect resources to upgrade your buildings, to upgrade your creatures, and in turn produce more resources and ad infinitum. Now, those games tend to be all over the map. And if you remember, we see them both in the more core type of the game with steeper learning curves and also in the more casual spectrum of the mobile gaming market. And those games tend to be not very connected. And if they have connections, they tend to be quite weak, which is kind of weird if you think that they're essentially all of the same genre. Now, if we go from the top to the bottom, we start by looking at games like Fallout Shelter or Jurassic Park Builder, that they are resource management, but they have like more mature themes like dinosaurs or the end of the world. At the center, we see the fairly neutral SimCity that's about building your city. And at the top, we look at things like My Hospital and Heyday, which tend to have lighter themes and art styles. Okay, so you might ask yourself, why is this important? Well, I think it's super important when you consider that the players that would be attracted to those type of games would be familiar with other games. So the complexity of the systems that you can onboard them on, the type of features that they know, the type of things that they expect from the game would largely differ between theme and theme. The second thing is the marketability of the game. So some themes tend to be more mass market, they would appeal to more players. And some themes would be more niche, but the trade-off is that those might be players that monetize better. So important to know themes as well. The final building block is the art style. And I'd like to use two games to illustrate why this is more important and tends to go underappreciated. So if you look on one hand at Love, Nikki, Dress Up Queen, it's a game that self-describes as having an interesting storyline, tens of thousands of gorgeous outfits, and hundreds of different styles to choose from. And on the other hand, I'd like to look at Fire Emblem Heroes. So this is an RPG game whose App Store description is an epic quest with intense battles where you strengthen your favorite heroes. And you might think those games tend to look quite different superficially, so how come they have a very high affinity value, something greater than 10? That might look surprising until you see the art and the icons for these games. And what I'd argue, and all this data comes from US players, is that at least in the United States, there's a subsegment of players that would be drawn to games that have the Japanese manga art style, and that might be more important to them than the actual type of the game they might be playing. So I've mentioned all these building blocks, and I think it's important to say that they work together. You can't just use one or another, but you need to think about all of them as a framework when you're creating your games. And this is what I want to talk about next. So you might ask yourself, this is all really nice, but if I'm not a big developer like King, if I don't have access to all this fancy data, could I still use it? So first of all, I think it's a very useful framework trying to define who your players are, putting yourself in the minds of the players, which is sometimes hard when we are very passionate about our own game and we tend to look at it through our own eyes. And it's also useful for iterating, pivoting, and better thinking about finding the right audience. If we start with the concept exploration, you can look at a lot of free data sources that are out there to gauge affinity. You can even look at the recommendations from the different platforms. You could look on Google, on App Store, on Steam. You could look at social media websites. You could look at streaming websites to get an approximation of what players care about and to think about each element individually. So if I look at one game, what other games do I get recommended? And theoretically, you could use that to build a long list of all the different cores, metas, themes, and styles. But odds are that you kind of already know roughly what your game is going to be about. So it's a shooter in space. And then you can start iterating and narrowing down on what kind of meta layers you'd like to create and to build around it and find something that you think would best resonate with your players. So at this point, you have a concept, you're feeling pretty good about yourself, you like what you ended up with. But before you actually sit down and code the game and write it, you might want to validate your hypothesis and to confront your thoughts with the actual players and see if it works. Now, there are different platforms that allow you to do that. But when we think about when the players first meet our games, or there's zero moment of truth, it's actually when they meet the App Store page or the page for the game. And this is where we have the screenshots, where we have the description of the game, where we say what the game is. And the great thing is that you can have that without actually writing a single line of code. you can present the idea of your game and show it to players using different platforms like the guys that parked right outside, Stormaven. You could talk with players. You can use a lot of different resources that are out there and promoting themselves here at GDC. And you could dress up your game in one or more ways. But the cool thing is that you can iterate. You could have slight variations on the art and the style. You could have slight variations on the core and the meta and test them against each other. And odds are is that one is going to do better than others. And that gives you a chance to rethink things and reiterate. Finally, there's the growth element. So it's really important to have a strong lifetime value for players and to have it higher than the cost per install. And to get lower cost per installs, you can start by going after players that might have affinity or strong affinity with one or more elements in your game, and then create the campaigns to promote this sort of element when you're pursuing those games, those players. So have bespoke campaigns to emphasize different elements when you're approaching different players and different audiences. And finally, if there's one takeaway to take from all of this, is to put the players first. Try to put yourself in the players' shoes, learn to know them any way you can. I really like this framework, naturally because I developed it. But I think any way you can try to put yourself in the player's head, to see what they like, and to try to rebuild those abstract things they like into one great product that they would love, that's the way to go, and the game would follow. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thanks, great session. You mentioned that you have different audience profile mapping roles for the players, like competition, community, and so forth, 12 in total. Why those 12? Did you have more originally, and then you kind of like decided that these 12 are the most important ones, or?
So the question is, why did we use those specific elements for player profiling or for audience profiling? So we've looked at a lot of different psychological frameworks that are out there. There are the different types of players. There's the immersive framework, and there's the Quantic Foundry framework. And we've actually tried a bunch of them. And we found that an adaptation that we've done on the Quantic Foundry and adjusting it to be more, the statements to be more mobile typical, a lot of it by just going after store descriptions and abstracting the different statements work best to predict affinity. So just finding the best correlation.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, so if no more other questions, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your GDC.